Hey guys, welcome back to Gluten-Free Habit. Today I'm going to show you how to make this soft gluten-free sandwich bread. Before I get started, I just want to give a big thank you to everyone who's subscribed already. I really appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope that you will so that you don't miss any of the new recipes. Making a gluten-free yeast bread can be a little bit intimidating, but with the right recipe, it doesn't have to be difficult. This is a recipe that I've developed myself, and I've made this same bread over and over and over with consistent results. And I love finally having a dependable recipe for soft, delicious gluten-free bread that I can make every week. So I'm excited to share it with you all now. I really hope you guys like it too. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think. And here are the ingredients. You'll need some brown rice flour, tapioca flour, cornstarch, xanthan gum, warm water, a little sugar, a package of active dry yeast, not instant, baking powder, salt, softened butter, apple cider vinegar, and some eggs at room temperature. You'll also need a 9x5 bread loaf pan. The one I'm using is actually stoneware, which is not typically what you use for making bread, but it works perfectly for this recipe, so I just go with it. Just make sure it's no bigger than 9x5 because even a tiny bit bigger can really affect the rise of the bread. And if you have one of these thermometers, these are really great for bread because it takes the guesswork out of knowing when it's actually done on the inside. The full recipe and directions can be found down below in the description box, and make sure that your ingredients are always gluten-free. Let's get started by greasing the pan. I just take good old-fashioned Crisco and I very lightly grease the bottom and the corners of the pan. I don't grease the sides of the pan though. I think it's better not to have the sides too slick because then the dough can grab the sides a little bit better when it's trying to rise. That may not be super scientific, but it works. It definitely makes the dough rise a little higher without the grease. Start by setting out a large mixing bowl and adding in all of your dry ingredients. Your brown rice flour, tapioca flour, cornstarch, xanthan gum, baking powder, and salt. Now whisk that all together. Measuring out your dry ingredients accurately is very important in gluten-free baking, so just make sure when you're measuring out your flour, you don't scoop the measuring cup into the bag because that would result in way too much flour. Instead, what you want to do is you want to spoon the flour into the measuring cup and then level it off on the top with the back edge of a knife. And of course, you can always measure by weight, and those measurements are in my recipe as well. Now set that aside and let's proof our yeast. Basically, all we're doing here is just testing the yeast to make sure that it's alive and active and ready to help our bread rise. To your warm water, add a full package of active dry yeast. Now add in your sugar. The sugar is really important because the yeast feeds on it. Stir that up. Now set a timer for about 5 minutes and we'll see what happens with the yeast. It should get a little bit foamy on top to let us know that it's active. Now let's work on the wet ingredients. In a medium-sized bowl, mix together your softened butter, eggs, and apple cider vinegar. Mix this up for a minute. For best results on this recipe, follow all of the directions exactly like I'm describing them. Both the ingredients and the process that I use are very important to the final result of the bread. And I know this because when I was developing this recipe, I think I tested it in about 1 million different ways. Now mix the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients. Mix this until the wet ingredients are all soaked up by the dry ingredients. It should look pretty dry and crumbly at this point. That's completely normal. Now take a look at your yeast. If there's foam on top, that's a good thing. That means that your yeast is active and ready to go. Go ahead and add it in. Once you've added in your active yeast, you can start mixing on low speed. If for some reason you don't have any foam on your yeast, then you should probably check the expiration date. It may be expired. Get yourself a new package and start again. This isn't super common. I don't think I've ever had it happen to me, but it's better to proof your yeast and make sure so that you don't waste your time or your ingredients. As the wet ingredients are absorbed, you can turn it up to medium. We're going to mix this for at least 7 minutes. This is where a stand mixer comes in really handy. I don't happen to have one, but put on some music and enjoy the time because the mixing really is important here. Unlike gluten breads, where you develop gluten by kneading, we obviously don't have any gluten to develop. But by beating a little bit longer like this, we're allowing the flours to absorb the liquids, we're working extra air into the batter, and we're helping the eggs to form some structure. And as a side note, the xanthan gum will also help to provide some of that structure. It's pretty good at mimicking gluten so that the bread will tear rather than crumble. After all that beating, your dough will look very smooth and it should have the appearance more of a thick cake batter rather than a traditional bread dough. I know that's kind of hard to get used to, but you'll actually be pouring this into the pan. Now set out your bread pan and scoop the dough into it. Take a minute to smooth out the top with a spatula. Now cover the pan with plastic wrap and set it aside in a warm area to rise. And you want to let it rise till the center of the bread reaches just about the top edge of the pan. Depending on the temperature where you are, this could take different times, but typically it's about 30 to 35 minutes for me. Be sure to remove your plastic wrap if you notice that the dough is starting to touch it. And then you can continue to let it rise without the wrap until you feel that it's done rising. Now it's time to bake. Carefully place your bread dough into a preheated oven. Towards the end of the baking time, you want to insert the thermometer, if you have one, to check the internal temperature. And if you don't have a thermometer, I would highly encourage you to get one if you can. There's nothing worse than taking the bread out of the oven, letting it cool for a couple hours, and then slicing into it and realizing you should have baked it longer. So I think a thermometer is a really smart investment if you plan on making bread occasionally. I make a loaf of bread every Sunday to last throughout the week, and I love knowing that when I take it out of the oven, I'll have consistent results every time. And here's our bread, fresh from the oven. Look how beautifully it's risen. What I do next is I just take a butter knife and I run it around the edge of the pan before I take out the bread. Next, I take a spatula and I just gently lift under each side of the bread to make sure that nothing's sticking. Now set out your wire rack and carefully turn out your bread. You can expect the bread to fall a little bit during the cooling process, but don't worry, you're still going to wind up with a large, beautiful, soft loaf of gluten-free bread. I usually leave the bread standing upright to cool it, but sometimes I tip it on its side for a little while. just to help the top keep its shape. And I thought I'd do a comparison for you. This is a store-bought loaf of gluten-free bread, so you can compare it to the homemade bread. And don't get me wrong, we've bought plenty of the store-bought gluten-free breads. They're definitely convenient, but it is nice to know that there are other options that you can make your own at home if you want, and in most cases you'll get a larger, softer, more cost-effective loaf of bread. Let your bread cool completely before you slice into it. This normally means at least 3 hours. I know it's really tempting to slice into it way ahead of that, but try to resist that temptation. When your bread is cool, get out a serrated knife and slice carefully, letting the knife do all the work. Once your bread has cooled, you'll want to wrap it in plastic wrap, especially after you've sliced into it. I leave mine on the counter for about 3 days, but anything I know that I won't be using before 3 days goes immediately into the freezer. In the description box below, I'll let you know how I prepare mine for the freezer. This bread is soft and flexible with a nice crust, and you can even tear it and it doesn't crumble into pieces. The only thing left to do now is enjoy your bread. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please do me a favor and give it a like by pressing the thumbs up down below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next gluten-free habit recipe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.